If you're upset about where you're sitting, Margaret, maybe you should just leave. My son's bride whispered to me at the pre-wedding party while holding a glass of champagne and smiling for the guests. I looked around the vineyard ballroom and realized no one seemed shocked by what she had just said. Not even my son. I smiled back at her, picked up my purse, and quietly walked out into the cold October night. By midnight, I had canceled everything. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're watching from, because tonight's story traveled farther than I ever imagined it would. The pre-wedding cocktail party was being held at Ashton Vineyards just outside Napa Valley, the same venue Daniel and I had toured together 8 months earlier. Back then, my son had wrapped an arm around my shoulders and said, "Dad would have loved this place, Mom." I remembered standing beneath strings of warm white lights while a jazz trio played softly in the background. I remembered thinking how proud my late husband would have been to see our son finally building a life with someone he loved. Or at least someone I thought he loved. The ballroom glowed with golden light that evening. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath the chandeliers. Waiters carried trays of crab cakes and miniature filet sliders through clusters of laughing guests dressed in expensive cocktail attire. Everything looked elegant. Perfect. Every flower arrangement had been chosen by me. Every menu tasting had been approved by me. Every deposit had been paid from my account. I had spent nearly $78,000 helping create this wedding because after Harold died 3 years earlier, family became the only thing in my life that still felt solid. Daniel was 35 now. Successful, handsome, kind-hearted in the quiet way his father used to be. And for most of his life, I believed no woman could ever truly turn him against me. I was wrong about that. I spotted Claire near the champagne tower surrounded by her bridesmaids, her pale silk dress catching the light each time she laughed. She looked beautiful, I'll give her that. Claire Bennett always knew how to look perfect in public. Her blonde hair never moved out of place. Her smile never cracked. Her voice always carried just enough sweetness to make people trust her instantly. But over the past 6 months, I had started noticing the small cuts hidden beneath the polish. Tiny things at first. She changed the wedding invitation design after I'd already paid for the originals because she said my choices felt a little dated. She removed Harold's favorite jazz song from the reception playlist because it lowered the energy. Then she quietly changed my role in the wedding program from mother of the groom to simply special guest. Daniel claimed it was a printing mistake. I pretended to believe him because mothers spend half their lives pretending not to notice pain when it comes from their children. Earlier that evening, when I arrived at the venue, I walked toward the reception table expecting to see my seat assignment beside the immediate family section. Instead, the young hostess handed me a cream-colored name card that read, Margaret Whitmore, sponsor. Not mother, not family, sponsor. Just the woman paying for everything. For a moment, I honestly thought there had been some mistake. But then Claire appeared beside me with that effortless smile of hers. "Oh good, you found your card," she said lightly. "We thought sponsor was more appropriate since you've been so generous." Her bridesmaids giggled softly behind her. I felt my fingers tighten around the edge of the card. "I see," I said quietly. "It's just for organization," Claire added. "You know how seating charts can get complicated." Then she turned away before I could answer. I stood there for several seconds staring at the word sponsor while guests brushed past me carrying champagne flutes. The card suddenly felt heavier than paper should feel. Still, I said nothing. I walked to my assigned table near the back corner of the ballroom beside distant cousins and business acquaintances, while Daniel sat at the family table beside Claire and her parents beneath a giant floral arch I had personally paid for. I told myself not to overreact. Weddings are stressful. Brides get overwhelmed. Families misunderstand each other. I kept repeating those excuses in my mind the same way people repeat prayers when they already know the storm is coming. About an hour later, an older gentleman approached my table smiling warmly. "Margaret," he said, "aren't you giving the mother-son toast tonight?" Before I could answer, Claire suddenly appeared beside us holding her champagne glass. "Oh no," she interrupted smoothly. "We decided to keep speeches limited to immediate family only." The man looked confused. "But she is immediate family." Claire laughed softly as if he'd made an innocent mistake. "Technically, yes, but we wanted the evening to feel modern and streamlined." I felt heat rise into my face. Around us, conversations began to quiet. A few guests glanced in my direction before quickly looking away. Daniel was standing only a few feet away near the dance floor. He heard every word, but he didn't move. He didn't say my name. He didn't even look at me. That hurt more than Claire ever could. The older gentleman awkwardly excused himself, leaving the two of us standing there beneath the chandelier light. Claire took a slow sip of champagne before leaning slightly closer to me. Honestly, Margaret, she said under her breath, if you're going to look miserable all night, maybe you should just go home. I don't want negativity ruining the atmosphere. Her tone stayed perfectly calm. That was the frightening part. No anger, no raised voice, just cold certainty. I looked past her toward my son. Daniel finally glanced in our direction for half a second before lowering his eyes toward the floor. And in that moment, something inside me became very still. I simply nodded once, picked up my purse, and walked toward the exit while the jazz trio continued playing behind me as though nothing had happened at all. Outside, the vineyard air felt cold against my skin. The parking lot lights blurred slightly through my tears, though I refused to let them fall. I sat behind the wheel of my Mercedes for several minutes, staring at the glowing ballroom windows in the distance. Then I reached into my purse, pulled out my phone, and opened the folder containing every contract connected to that wedding. The drive back to San Francisco took almost 2 hours because of the rain. Traffic crawled along the highway while windshield wipers dragged rhythmically across the glass like a metronome counting down the end of something I had spent years trying to protect. I kept both hands steady on the steering wheel even though my chest felt hollow. The strange thing about humiliation is that it does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it settles quietly into your bones while jazz music plays in the background and people pretend not to notice. By the time I pulled into the driveway of my house, it was nearly 11 o'clock. The porch lights still glowed warmly against the dark, exactly the way Harold used to leave it for me whenever I worked late at the gallery years ago. For a moment, I simply sat inside the car staring at the front door. This house had once been loud with life. Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas mornings, Daniel running through the hallway in Little League uniforms with grass stains on his knees while Harold shouted for him to slow down before he broke another lamp. Back then, family felt permanent. I walked inside slowly and hung my coat on the brass hook beside the staircase. The silence wrapped around me immediately. No music, no laughter, no champagne glasses clinking beneath expensive chandeliers. Just the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room. I slipped off my heels and carried them in one hand as I walked toward the kitchen. The marble countertops reflected the dim under-cabinet lights Harold installed himself nearly 15 years earlier. He used to say warm lighting made a house feel loved. I poured myself a glass of water but did not drink it. My hands were trembling slightly now that no one was watching. On the kitchen island sat a leather binder filled with wedding contracts, venue agreements, floral invoices, catering schedules, final payments. Everything organized alphabetically because I had spent most of my adult life believing careful planning could protect the people you loved from disappointment. I opened the binder slowly. Ashton Vineyards, $42,000. Paid in full. Hawthorne Floral Design, $11,600. Paid in full. Golden Coast Catering, $18,000 deposit plus liquor package upgrades. Paid in full. I stared at the numbers without emotion. Money had never mattered much to me after Harold died. Not really. The insurance settlement from his architecture firm and the sale of our vacation property in Carmel left me financially comfortable. What mattered was Daniel, my only child, the little boy who used to wait by the front window every afternoon when I came home from work. The teenager who once told me no woman would ever replace me as his best friend. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being his mother and became something easier to overlook. Something useful. My phone buzzed suddenly against the countertop. Claire's name flashed across the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. Margaret, she said brightly, as though nothing uncomfortable had happened earlier that evening. I think maybe we got off on the wrong foot tonight. I almost admired how quickly she recovered. Did we? I asked calmly. A small silence followed. You know weddings are stressful, she continued. Everyone is emotional. I just do not want unnecessary tension before the ceremony. Unnecessary tension. I looked down at the open contracts spread across my kitchen island. Of course, I said quietly. I am glad you called. Her voice softened immediately, relief slipping through her tone. Good. Daniel feels terrible that things became awkward. I noticed she did not say he felt terrible about what she had done, only that things became awkward. Is Daniel there? I asked. He is in the shower right now, she answered quickly. But he wanted me to smooth things over. I closed my eyes briefly. 20 years ago, Daniel would have climbed mountains for me. Now another woman handled his apologies like customer service complaints. Well, I said softly, you should both enjoy the rest of your evening. So we are okay? She asked. The question hung there for a second longer than she intended. I finally smiled to myself. Claire, I said, you told me exactly where I belong tonight. I appreciate clarity. Before she could answer, I ended the call. The kitchen became silent again, except for the ticking clock in the other room. I stood there motionless for nearly a minute. Then I opened my laptop. My reflection stared back at me from the darkened screen before it lit up across my face. Older now, tired around the eyes, but steady, very steady. I logged into my email first. There were dozens of wedding confirmations waiting inside a folder labeled Daniel and Claire Wedding Weekend. I opened the contract for Ashton Vineyards and scrolled down to the cancellation clause. Non-refundable deposit. Remaining balance eligible for cancellation if requested more than 48 hours before event setup. I glanced at the clock on the microwave. 11:17 p.m. The wedding rehearsal dinner was scheduled for Saturday evening. The ceremony itself was still 4 days away. Slowly, I reached for my phone and dialed the vineyard coordinator. A sleepy voice answered after the third ring. This is Melanie. Hello, Melanie, I said politely. This is Margaret Whitmore. I need to cancel the Whitmore-Bennett wedding immediately. The woman from Ashton Vineyards sounded confused at first. Mrs. Whitmore, are you certain? She asked carefully. I could hear papers shuffling on her end of the line and the faint echo of office music in the background. The wedding weekend is only a few days away. I sat at my kitchen island staring at the rain sliding down the windows above the sink. I understand, I replied calmly. But I am the contract holder, and I would like to cancel immediately. Another pause followed. There will be penalties, she warned gently. I understand that too. My voice never changed. Somewhere deep inside me, the grief had already passed. What remained was clarity. By midnight, I had canceled the vineyard. 20 minutes later, I canceled the catering company. The florist tried to convince me to reconsider because the white orchids had already arrived from Santa Barbara that morning. The jazz trio had blocked out the entire weekend for the event. The wedding cake designer sounded almost heartbroken when she explained they had spent 3 days handcrafting sugar flowers for Claire's 6-tier cake. I apologized to every single one of them. I remained polite, calm, professional. That was the part people never understand about women my age. They expect tears, begging, emotional scenes. But after nearly 70 years of life, you learn that silence can dismantle things far more completely than anger ever could. At 12:43 in the morning, my phone finally rang again. Daniel. I stared at his name glowing against the screen for several seconds before answering. Mom. His voice sounded tired and uneasy. Claire just got an email from the florist saying the wedding order was canceled. I leaned back slowly in my chair. Yes, I answered. Silence. Then a nervous laugh. Okay, I am assuming there has been some misunderstanding. No misunderstanding. Another silence followed, heavier this time. I could picture him standing somewhere inside their downtown penthouse apartment, running one hand through his dark hair the same way Harold used to whenever he was stressed. Mom, he said carefully. Claire said things got tense tonight, but canceling the entire wedding is a little extreme. Extreme. I looked around the kitchen Harold and I spent 25 years building together. The copper cookware hanging above the stove. The framed family photos beside the refrigerator. Daniel at age 6 holding a fishing pole beside Lake Tahoe. Daniel at 16 wearing his graduation suit while Harold stood proudly beside him. Every inch of this house carried proof of sacrifice. Proof of love. Do you know what she called me tonight? I asked quietly. Daniel exhaled sharply. Mom, she did not mean anything by it. That answer told me everything. Not what did she say? Not are you okay? Just another excuse carefully wrapped around Claire's behavior like expensive ribbon. I see, I said softly. She was stressed. He continued quickly. The seating arrangements got complicated. Her parents have been demanding things nonstop. Everyone is overwhelmed right now. I closed my eyes briefly. Daniel, I asked, when that man asked why I was not sitting with family tonight, why did you look away? He went silent immediately. I heard movement in the background, a door shutting softly somewhere behind him. Mom, no, I interrupted. Gently. I would actually like to know. His voice lowered. I did not want to make a scene. The sadness that settled over me then felt strangely peaceful. For months I had been telling myself Claire was the problem. Claire was manipulative. Claire was cold. Claire was slowly pushing me out. But standing there in my kitchen after midnight, listening to my son defend my humiliation because confrontation made him uncomfortable, I realized something much worse. Claire could only take the space Daniel allowed her to take. You know, I said quietly, your father once worked 72 hours straight during the recession because he refused to lay off his employees before Christmas. Daniel said nothing. Do you remember what he used to tell you when you were little? I continued. A man who stays silent while someone is being disrespected is participating in it. I heard his breathing catch slightly. Harold had repeated that sentence often during Daniel's childhood. Respect mattered deeply to him, especially inside family. Mom, please, Daniel said finally. Can we just talk about this tomorrow when everyone calms down? I looked down at the cancellation confirmations, filling my email inbox one after another. Venue canceled. Catering canceled. Music canceled. Photography canceled. Nearly everything was gone now. There is nothing left to discuss tonight, I answered. The contracts have already been terminated. You actually canceled everything? His voice cracked with disbelief. Margaret Whitmore. Claire's voice suddenly appeared in the background, sharp and distant. Tell her she cannot do this. I smiled faintly to myself when I heard panic beneath her perfect composure for the first time. Daniel lowered his voice again. Mom, people are flying in from all over the country for this wedding. Then perhaps Claire should have treated the host with more care. Host, he repeated bitterly. You are my mother. The irony of that statement settled between us heavily. Am I? I asked softly. Another silence. Long enough for truth to settle into the cracks. Finally he spoke again, quieter this time. You are really willing to destroy my wedding over one bad night. I stared out at the rain beyond the kitchen windows. No, Daniel, I said calmly. Your wedding was destroyed the moment the woman you chose believed she could throw your mother away in public, and you decided protecting her feelings mattered more than protecting my dignity. Then, before either of them could answer, I ended the call and turned off my phone completely. I did not sleep that night. Around 2 a.m, I carried a blanket into the living room and sat beside the fireplace with a cup of untouched tea growing cold in my hands. The house felt different now. Not emptier exactly. Clearer. Like fog finally lifting from a road I had been driving down for years without realizing how lost I was. The rain outside softened sometime before dawn, leaving only the occasional drip from the gutters and the distant hum of cars moving through wet streets. I stared at the framed photograph above the mantel for a long time. Harold stood beside me at Daniel's college graduation, his arm around my waist, both of us smiling proudly while Daniel held his diploma between us. We looked like one of those families people envy quietly from a distance. Stable, loving, untouchable. Harold used to tell me that families rarely break all at once. He said they erode slowly through tolerated disrespect, ignored boundaries, and silence disguised as peacekeeping. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. Harold saw things earlier than I did. Around 7 the next morning, my phone exploded with notifications the moment I turned it back on. 12 missed calls from Daniel. 3 from Claire. 2 from Claire's mother, Patricia Bennett. Several text messages from vendors asking for confirmation regarding cancellations. One message from the wedding planner simply read, Margaret, please call me immediately. There is confusion this morning. I set the phone face down beside me without responding. Sunlight crept weakly through the windows, pale and gray after the storm. I rose slowly from the couch and walked into the kitchen. My body felt heavy from exhaustion, but my mind remained strangely calm. I toasted a slice of sourdough bread and listened to the quiet crackling sound, while coffee brewed in the background. Such ordinary little noises. Funny how life continues behaving normally even after something inside you changes permanently. As I carried my coffee toward the dining room, the doorbell rang sharply through the house. I glanced at the clock. 7:42 a.m. too early for courtesy. I already knew who it was before I opened the door. Claire stood on the front porch wearing oversized sunglasses despite the cloudy morning. Her cream-colored cashmere coat hung open over wrinkled clothes from the night before, and for the first time since I had known her, she looked disorganized. Behind her, Daniel leaned against the passenger side of his black Range Rover with both hands shoved into his pockets. He looked exhausted. Claire stepped inside immediately without waiting to be invited. "Margaret, this has gone far enough," she said quickly. No greeting. No apology. Just urgency. I closed the front door carefully behind them. "Good morning, Claire." She removed her sunglasses, revealing swollen eyes and smudged mascara beneath them. "The venue says they legally cannot proceed because your name is on every contract." "That is correct. The florist canceled the installations. The caterers refunded half the payment but kept the deposits. The planner says there is no way to rebuild everything before Saturday." I nodded once. "That is unfortunate." Her composure cracked slightly then. "Unfortunate?" she repeated. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to us right now?" Before I could answer, Daniel finally stepped inside. He looked older than he had 24 hours earlier. "Mom," he said quietly, "can we just sit down and talk?" I motioned toward the dining room. The three of us sat around the same oak table where Daniel used to do homework as a child while I cooked dinner nearby. Claire remained stiff beside him, gripping her phone tightly in both hands. I noticed she had already switched engagement photos on her social media accounts to private. "Damage control. Margaret," she began carefully, forcing softness back into her tone. "I think emotions got heightened yesterday, and maybe things were said poorly." Said poorly. Such delicate wording for humiliation. I stirred cream slowly into my coffee. "You told me to leave. I was overwhelmed. You told me I was ruining the atmosphere." Claire inhaled sharply. "I did not mean it literally." "Then how exactly should I have interpreted it?" Silence settled over the table. Daniel rubbed one hand across his forehead. "Mom, Claire already admitted she handled things badly." "No," I corrected calmly. "She admitted things were stressful. That is not the same as accountability." Claire's jaw tightened slightly. There it was again, that flash beneath the polished surface. The irritation that always appeared whenever someone refused to move according to her script. "What do you want from me?" she finally asked. I looked at her for several seconds before answering. "Honesty." She blinked. "About what?" "About how long you have resented me." Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside her. Claire laughed softly, but there was no warmth in it. "That is ridiculous." "Is it?" I reached beside me toward the buffet cabinet and picked up the cream-colored place card I had brought home from the party the night before. "Sponsor." I slid it slowly across the table toward her. "You did not humiliate me accidentally, Claire. People do not reduce someone to a wallet by mistake." Daniel stared at the card in silence. His face paled slightly as though he was seeing it clearly for the first time. Claire crossed her arms. "It was a joke." "No," I said quietly. "It was a message." The room became very still after that. Outside, a delivery truck rolled slowly down the street while sprinklers hissed somewhere nearby across damp morning lawns. Ordinary life continuing again. Daniel finally looked at Claire. "Did you really think this was funny?" Her expression hardened immediately. "Oh my God, Daniel, not you too. Answer the question." She stood abruptly from the table. "I cannot believe this is happening right now. Your mother is destroying our wedding because she cannot handle not being the center of attention for one night." I watched Daniel carefully then because sometimes the most important moments in a family happen quietly. No screaming. No dramatic music. Just truth finally. Standing naked in the middle of the room, waiting for someone to acknowledge it. And for the first time since this nightmare began, my son did not defend her. Claire stared at Daniel as though she genuinely expected him to rescue her the way he always had before. I could almost see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the quick search for the right tone, the right expression, the right emotional pressure to pull him back onto her side. But Daniel stayed silent. He looked down at the cream-colored place card lying on the table between us, as if the single word printed across it had suddenly become impossible to ignore. Sponsor. Not mother. Not family. Just a financial role. Claire let out a sharp breath and folded her arms tighter across her chest. "This is unbelievable," she muttered. "One seating card, and suddenly I am some kind of villain." "It was not one seating card," I said quietly. "It was months of small humiliations." Her eyes snapped toward me immediately. "Humiliations?" she repeated with disbelief. "Margaret, I included you in everything." I almost smiled at that. Included. as though I were some distant relative invited out of obligation instead of the woman who had spent nearly $80,000 helping create the wedding she wanted. Daniel finally lifted his eyes toward her. Did you really remove Mom from the family toast on purpose? Claire laughed again, but this time the sound came brittle and strained. Oh my God, Daniel, not everything is some conspiracy. Answer him, I said softly. The room fell still again. Claire looked at me for several long seconds before turning back toward Daniel. Yes, she admitted finally. I adjusted a few things because your mother has a tendency to make emotional moments about herself. The words landed heavily in the quiet dining room. Daniel blinked slowly as though he could not believe she had actually said them out loud. What does that even mean? He asked. Claire shook her head impatiently. Come on, Daniel. Every dinner becomes a memory about your father. Every holiday becomes some sentimental performance about tradition and family history and old stories nobody even remembers. I felt something cold settle inside my chest then. Not anger. Recognition. Claire continued before either of us could respond. You are 35 years old and your entire life still revolves around protecting your mother's feelings. Daniel stared at her silently. Claire, he said carefully, you are talking about my mother. Exactly, she snapped. Your mother, not your wife. The second those words left her mouth, I knew something inside Daniel shifted permanently. You could see it happen in his face, like someone finally turning on a light in a dark room. For the first time, he was not hearing isolated comments or awkward little moments he could explain away individually. He was hearing the truth underneath all of it. The resentment, the competition, the quiet hostility she had been dressing up as sophistication for months. Claire realized it too late. Her expression changed almost instantly. Softer now. Careful again. Daniel, she said quickly, reaching for his hand. That is not what I meant. But he pulled his hand back before she could touch it. The movement was small, barely noticeable, yet somehow louder than shouting. Claire looked stunned. You embarrassed my mother in front of everyone, he said quietly. And then you told her to leave. Because she was judging me all night. No, I said calmly. I was watching. Claire turned toward me sharply. You have hated me from the beginning. I shook my head slowly. No, Claire. If I hated you, I never would have paid for your wedding. Tears suddenly filled her eyes then, though something about them felt rehearsed. I cannot believe you are both doing this to me right now. I noticed how quickly the language changed. Not what happened between us. Not the pain caused. Just what was being done to her. Outside the dining room windows, the clouds had finally begun to clear. Thin strips of sunlight stretched across the hardwood floors, warm and golden against the silence hanging over the table. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair and rubbed both hands across his face. He looked exhausted. Older somehow. Did you ever even want my mother there? He asked quietly. Claire hesitated 1 second too long. That was all it took. Of course I did, she answered quickly afterward. But Daniel had already seen it. So had I. There are moments in life when truth arrives without needing evidence. A hesitation. A glance. A silence that lasts half a heartbeat too long. Daniel stood up slowly from the table and walked toward the kitchen windows without speaking. Claire watched him carefully, panic flickering beneath her composure again. Daniel, she said softly, please do not let this spiral into something ridiculous. He turned around then, and for the first time since I had met Claire Bennett, my son looked at her the way a stranger would. Without excuses. Without protection. Just observation. Ridiculous, he repeated quietly. You called my mother a sponsor. Claire opened her mouth to answer, but he continued before she could. You removed her from the family table. You cut her out of speeches. And when people noticed, you told her to leave. His voice remained calm, but disappointment carried through every word. Claire stood abruptly from her chair. I am not staying here to be attacked. She grabbed her purse from the back of the chair with shaking hands. Fine. Cancel the stupid wedding. See if I care. But her voice cracked slightly on the last sentence, exposing the lie underneath it. She cared very much. Because for the first time since this began, she no longer controlled the room. Claire moved quickly toward the front door, her heels striking sharply against the hardwood floors. Daniel did not follow her. He did not call her name. He simply stood motionless beside the window while the front door slammed shut through the house with a sound that echoed far longer than it should have. Then silence returned again. Deep, heavy, honest. After several seconds, my son finally turned toward me. His eyes looked tired in a way I had never seen before. "Mom," he said quietly, "how long have you been pretending everything was okay?" Daniel remained standing beside the dining room window long after Claire left. The morning sunlight had fully broken through the clouds now, casting pale gold reflections across the hardwood floor while the silence between us settled into something fragile and unfamiliar. I looked at my son carefully. He had Harold's height, Harold's dark hair, even Harold's habit of clenching his jaw whenever emotion became too heavy to carry comfortably. But in that moment, he looked less like the confident executive everyone admired, and more like the little boy who used to stand frozen after making mistakes he did not know how to fix. "How long?" he asked again quietly. I folded my hands around the warm coffee cup in front of me before answering. Long enough that I started questioning my own instincts. Daniel lowered his eyes immediately. "Mom, do you remember Christmas 2 years ago?" I asked softly. He frowned slightly, caught off guard by the question. "At your apartment?" "Yes." I watched recognition slowly move across his face. Claire told me dinner was being moved later because some of her co-workers were running behind. Daniel said nothing. I arrived at 7:30 exactly like she asked. I continued. But everyone had already eaten. His expression tightened. "I thought you were late." "That is what Claire told you." He sat down slowly across from me again, his face pale now. "She said you changed the time yourself." I gave a small nod. That was the first time I realized something felt wrong. The room remained quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. Daniel stared at the table for several seconds before speaking again. "Why did you never tell me?" I almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, but because mothers spend so much of their lives protecting relationships that are quietly damaging them. Because every time something happened, there was always an explanation waiting for me. I answered calmly. A misunderstanding, stress, miscommunication. And every time I tried to tell myself I was imagining things because the alternative was admitting my son saw my pain and chose comfort over confrontation. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. The truth hurt him now. I could see that. But pain is sometimes the only thing strong enough to wake people up. She made me feel guilty any time I disagreed with her, he admitted quietly after a while. If I defended you, she said I was too attached to my mother. If I asked questions, she accused me of not supporting her. He leaned back heavily in the chair. After a while, it became easier to stay quiet. I looked at him carefully. Easier for who? That question stayed hanging between us. Daniel rubbed both hands across his face again before standing up abruptly and walking toward the kitchen counter. He looked exhausted, truly exhausted. I do love her, he said finally, though his voice sounded uncertain now. I know, I answered gently. That is what makes this painful. He turned toward me then. Did you cancel everything because you wanted revenge? I thought about that honestly before responding. Outside, a breeze moved softly through the maple trees lining the street, scattering tiny shadows across the windows. No, I said quietly. I canceled everything because I finally understood something your father tried to teach me years ago. Daniel waited silently. When people become comfortable humiliating you, kindness stops being generosity and starts becoming permission. My son lowered his gaze immediately after hearing that. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then his phone buzzed loudly against the counter. Claire. Her name flashed repeatedly across the screen. Daniel stared at it without answering. It stopped, then started again almost immediately. On the fourth call, he finally picked it up. What? His voice sounded tired now rather than angry. Claire's voice burst through the speaker loudly enough for me to hear pieces of it from across the kitchen. Cannot believe you left me alone. My parents are furious. People are asking questions. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Claire, calm down. Do not tell me to calm down, she snapped. Your mother destroyed our wedding. Daniel looked toward me instinctively. I held his gaze steadily without speaking. No, he said quietly into the phone after several seconds. You did that. Silence exploded on the other end. Even from across the room, I could feel it. Then Claire laughed sharply. Cold. Disbelieving. Wow, she said. So now you are turning against me too? Daniel leaned one hand against the kitchen counter. I am trying to understand. How things got this bad. Things got bad because your mother cannot stand not controlling everything. I watched Daniel carefully while Claire continued talking rapidly through the phone. Excuses. Deflections. Blame. Every sentence circling responsibility without ever touching it. Finally, he interrupted her quietly. Why did you call her a sponsor? Silence. A long one this time. Claire, he pressed again. Her answer came softer now, because sometimes it felt like she used money to stay involved in every part of our lives. Daniel frowned slightly. She paid for the wedding because we could not afford the kind of wedding you wanted. Another silence followed. Then Claire said something that changed everything. Exactly. Just one word. Quiet. Sharp. Honest before she could stop herself. I saw the realization hit my son immediately. Not appreciation. Expectation. Claire had not viewed my help as generosity. She had viewed it as obligation. Something owed to her. Daniel straightened slowly from the counter. I need some time, he said quietly. Daniel, do not you dare walk away from me right now. But he already had. He ended the call without another word and set the phone down carefully beside the sink. The kitchen became silent again except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of lawn equipment somewhere down the block. Daniel stared out the window for a very long time before finally speaking again. Dad saw this coming, did he not? I looked down into my coffee cup before answering. Harold worried about the way she spoke to people she thought could not benefit her. My son swallowed hard, and I ignored him. Yes, I said softly. You did. Daniel left my house shortly after noon that day. He said he needed air, but I knew what he really needed was distance from the version of his life that had suddenly stopped making sense. I watched from the front window as he climbed slowly into his Range Rover and sat there for nearly a minute without turning the engine on. His shoulders looked heavy, defeated almost. Then he finally drove away, disappearing beyond the maple trees lining the street while sunlight flickered across the wet pavement. Left behind by the storm, the house became quiet again after that. Deeply quiet. I carried our empty coffee cups into the kitchen and washed them slowly beneath warm running water. Tiny, ordinary motions. The kind that keep your hands occupied while your heart catches up to reality. Around 2 in the afternoon, I decided to walk down to the marina near the Embarcadero. Harold and I used to go there on Saturdays when Daniel was little. We would buy clam chowder and sourdough bowls from a small seafood stand and sit watching ferries drift through the bay while Daniel fed pieces of bread to seagulls. Some places hold memories so gently that even grief feels softer there. The air smelled like salt water and cold wind when I arrived. Sailboats rocked quietly against the docks while tourists wandered past souvenir shops carrying paper coffee cups and shopping bags. I pulled my coat tighter around myself and walked slowly along the waterfront, letting the noise of strangers calm my thoughts. That was when I heard someone call my name. Margaret. I turned and saw Evelyn Parker standing outside a small cafe near the marina entrance. Evelyn had been one of Harold's closest friends for nearly 30 years. Sharp-minded, elegant, the type of woman who noticed everything even when she pretended not to. She hugged me warmly the moment I approached. I heard the wedding was canceled, she said carefully. I gave a small nod. News travels fast. Evelyn sighed softly. San Francisco society survives almost entirely on gossip and overpriced wine. Despite myself, I smiled faintly. She touched my arm gently. Come have tea with me. We sat beside the cafe window overlooking the water while fog rolled slowly across the bay in thin silver ribbons. Evelyn stirred honey into her tea for several seconds before speaking again. Harold worried about that girl, she said quietly. I looked up immediately. Claire. Evelyn nodded. He mentioned it to me about a year before he passed. Something tightened in my chest. He never told me. Because he knew you loved Daniel enough to overlook things. I stared out toward the water silently while she continued. There was a dinner party at the Langford's house last spring. Claire thought Harold had stepped outside when she was talking with 2 women near the patio. Evelyn paused carefully, but he was still inside. I looked back at her slowly. What did she say? Evelyn hesitated. She joked that marrying Daniel meant she would never have to worry about money again because his mother practically worshipped him. The words settled heavily between us. Not shocking exactly, just painful because they fit too neatly into pieces I had already started connecting myself. Harold confronted her privately afterward. Evelyn continued quietly. He told her family was not a business arrangement. I swallowed hard. And Evelyn gave a sad little smile. Claire laughed and told him older people always mistake ambition for selfishness. I looked down at my untouched tea. Harold carried this concern alone while he was dying. The thought hurt more than I expected. Evelyn reached across the table and touched my hand gently. Margaret, there is something else you should know. Her expression shifted then, more serious now. A few weeks ago, I attended a charity luncheon downtown. Claire was there with some friends. I felt a slow heaviness settle into my stomach before she even continued. One of the women mentioned how generous you had been paying for the wedding. Evelyn's fingers tightened slightly around her teacup. Claire laughed and said, "Well, if Margaret wants to buy herself relevance, who am I to stop her?" For a moment, the sounds inside the cafe seemed very far away. Dishes clinking, espresso machines steaming, quiet conversations blending into background noise. I stared at the tablecloth while the sentence repeated itself in my mind. By her self-relevance. Evelyn spoke softly now. "I wanted to tell you then, but Harold had just passed, and I convinced myself maybe I misunderstood the tone." I nodded slowly. "No," I said quietly. "You understood it perfectly." Outside the cafe window, the fog thickened slowly over the bay until the distant boats became blurred shadows against gray water. Funny how clearly you can see people once love stops editing their behavior for you. I thought back over dozens of moments I had excused away during the past 2 years. Claire discouraging Daniel from Sunday dinners because weekends were for couples. Claire rolling her eyes whenever Harold talked about family traditions. Claire once telling me my pearl necklace looked a little too grandmotherly before offering to help me choose something more modern for the wedding. Tiny cuts, tiny dismissals, each one small enough to survive alone. Together, they formed a pattern impossible to ignore. My phone buzzed suddenly inside my purse. "Daniel." I stared at his name for a second before answering. His voice sounded strained immediately. "Mom, are you busy?" No, a pause. Then he exhaled shakily. "I just found something." The way he said it made my stomach tighten instantly. "What is it?" Another pause followed. Longer this time. "Claire left her laptop open when she stormed out earlier," he said quietly. "And I found messages between her and one of her friends." I closed my eyes slowly. Somewhere deep inside me, I already knew whatever came next would change everything. Daniel arrived at my house less than 40 minutes after calling me from the marina. By the time I pulled into the driveway, his Range Rover was already parked outside beneath the maple trees, crooked enough to show he had not been thinking clearly when he left it there. The late afternoon sky hung low and silver over San Francisco, and cold wind carried fallen leaves across the sidewalk as I walked toward the front door. Daniel was pacing inside the living room when I entered. He looked pale, truly pale. His tie was gone now, and the sleeves of his white dress shirt were rolled unevenly to his elbows like he had done it without noticing. He stopped pacing the second he saw me. "Mom," he said quietly. I set my purse down slowly beside the entry table. "What happened?" Daniel ran one hand across his face before answering. "I went back to the apartment to pick up some things." His voice sounded hollow. Claire left her laptop open on the kitchen counter. Something in his expression made my chest tighten immediately. And he swallowed hard. There were messages between her and her friend Nicole. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone with shaking fingers. I took pictures before she realized I saw them. For several seconds, he simply stared down at the screen without speaking. Like even now part of him still wished he had misunderstood what he read. Then he handed me the phone silently. The first screenshot showed a message from Nicole sent 3 weeks earlier. "Girl, your future mother-in-law seriously acts like she is part of the marriage." Beneath it, Claire's response appeared almost immediately. "Please. Margaret thinks paying for the wedding makes her important." My eyes moved lower. Another message. "At least she has money." Claire replied with a laughing emoji before writing. "Exactly. I can tolerate old people if they are useful." Daniel turned away while I continued reading. I felt strangely calm again. Not numb. Just unsurprised in the deepest possible way. There were dozens of messages. Tiny pieces of contempt scattered casually through ordinary conversations. Claire complaining that I called Daniel too often after Harold died. Claire mocking the way I decorated my house. Claire joking that once the wedding happened, Daniel would finally cut the cord completely. Then I reached the message that explained everything. Nicole had asked whether Claire actually loved Daniel or just loved the lifestyle that came with him. Claire answered, "Both. But honestly, the family money definitely helps." Beneath that came another line sent just a few seconds later. "Once Harold died, Margaret became emotionally desperate. It made everything easier." I stared at those words for a very long time. Emotionally desperate. Easier. Not grief. Not loneliness. Just vulnerability to exploit. Daniel spoke quietly behind me. There is more. I looked up slowly. His face had gone completely still now. The kind of stillness people get when heartbreak finally hardens into clarity. He walked toward the fireplace and stared at the framed family photographs lining the mantel. Scroll down. I lowered my eyes back to the phone screen. The final screenshots were from the night before the cocktail party. Nicole wrote, "You better be nice to his mother until after the honeymoon." Claire answered, "Please. Daniel never stands up to me anyway." Another message followed immediately afterward. "Margaret is so afraid of losing him that she will always come crawling back." Something inside me broke quietly then. Not because the words were cruel. Cruelty I could survive. What hurt was realizing how accurately Claire had understood my silence. She knew I tolerated disrespect because I feared losing my son. She understood my weakness before I did. Daniel finally turned back toward me. His eyes looked red now, though he had not cried. "I read every message," he said softly. "Every single one." I handed the phone back carefully. "I am sorry." He gave a hollow little laugh at that. "You are sorry?" He shook his head slowly. "Mom, she was using us. All of us." He sat heavily on the couch and leaned forward with both elbows resting on his knees. "Dad knew. You knew something was wrong. And I kept defending her." I moved slowly into the armchair across from him. Evening shadows had begun stretching through the living room now, dimming the golden light around Harold's photographs and the old oak bookshelves lining the walls. "Love can make intelligent people ignore obvious things," I said gently. Daniel stared down at his hands. "No," he answered quietly. "This was not love. This was weakness." The sadness in his voice nearly undid me then because for the first time since Harold died, my son sounded emotionally unguarded again. Like himself. "I kept telling myself relationships required compromise," he continued. "But every compromise somehow involved losing pieces of you. Or Dad. Or our family." He rubbed both hands over his face again before whispering. And I let it happen. Silence settled softly between us. Outside, headlights moved slowly across the front windows as evening traffic passed along the street. Somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed briefly through the city before fading away again. Ordinary life continuing while ours quietly unraveled. Daniel finally looked up at me. "She is not answering my calls now." I nodded once. "She probably realizes you know the truth. Her parents called me selfish for postponing the wedding." His laugh sounded tired now. "Postponing. Like that is still what this is." I studied my son carefully across the dim room. He looked heartbroken, but underneath the heartbreak, something steadier had started forming. Self-respect. "Finally, what are you going to do?" I asked softly. Daniel leaned back slowly against the couch cushions and stared at the darkening ceiling for several seconds before answering. "For the first time in 2 years," he said quietly, "I think I need to stop worrying about losing her and start worrying about what staying with her would turn me into." 3 months later, the vineyard wedding that had once consumed every conversation in our lives existed only as scattered refunds, unopened gift registries, and uncomfortable gossip drifting through San Francisco charity events. People still talked about it occasionally. They lowered their voices when they saw me at restaurants or gallery openings, pretending discretion while searching my face for bitterness. But bitterness requires emotional attachment, and by then something inside me had already let go. Claire moved out of the downtown penthouse 2 weeks after Daniel found the messages on her laptop. The breakup itself happened quietly. No dramatic scenes. No public accusations. Just 2 exhausted people sitting across from each other in a luxury apartment, finally acknowledging truths they could no longer edit into something prettier. Daniel told me later that Claire cried when he ended things. Not because she loved him deeply, he realized, but because consequences had finally arrived in a form she could not manipulate. Her parents blamed me publicly for months afterward. Patricia Bennett told several people at a fundraiser that I had emotionally blackmailed my son into canceling the wedding. I heard about it through mutual friends and simply smiled. People committed to misunderstanding you will always find language that protects their version of events. I no longer needed to defend myself against strangers desperate to avoid uncomfortable truths. Daniel changed after everything happened. At first, the change looked like exhaustion. He lost weight, stopped answering unnecessary calls, started spending evenings alone instead of burying himself in endless social obligations. But slowly, over time, something steadier emerged beneath the heartbreak. Clarity. One Sunday afternoon about a month after the breakup, he came over carrying 2 grocery bags and quietly asked if I wanted help planting new flowers in the backyard garden. Harold used to spend entire weekends out there carefully tending roses while Daniel followed him around asking endless questions about soil and sunlight. Watching my grown son kneel beside the flower beds beneath the soft California afternoon light, dirt staining the knees of his jeans while he laughed softly at his own terrible gardening skills, felt strangely healing. Not because everything had been repaired. Some things never fully are. But because honesty had finally returned to our family, and honesty creates a different kind of peace than denial ever can. One evening while we sat on the back patio drinking iced tea, Daniel looked toward the sunset stretching orange and gold across the hills behind the neighborhood and quietly said, "I think I spent 2 years confusing keeping someone happy with loving them." I looked at him carefully over the rim of my glass. "There is a difference," I answered softly. He nodded slowly. "Dad tried to teach me that." A warm breeze moved through the garden then, carrying the faint scent of jasmine and rosemary through the air. Somewhere nearby, children laughed while riding bicycles down the street. Ordinary sounds. Safe sounds. The kind that remind you life keeps offering small beginnings even after painful endings. About 6 weeks after the canceled wedding, I received a handwritten envelope in the mail. Claire's name appeared neatly across the front in careful blue ink. I almost threw it away unopened. Instead, I carried it into the kitchen and sat quietly beside the window before unfolding the letter inside. The apology was polished, controlled. Claire admitted she had been insensitive and overwhelmed by pressure. She wrote that wedding stress had caused her to lose perspective and that she hoped one day I could forgive the misunderstanding that escalated everything. I read the letter twice before folding it carefully again. Not once did she mention respect. Not once did she acknowledge humiliation. Even her apology tried protecting her image more than addressing harm. I placed the letter back into the envelope and locked it inside the bottom drawer of my desk beside old family photographs and insurance papers. Some things are worth keeping simply as reminders of what clarity cost you. In early spring, I sold the Carmel vacation property Harold and I had held on to for years after his death. Daniel worried at first that I was making an emotional decision, but the truth was simpler than that. I no longer wanted to spend my life preserving places out of guilt or nostalgia. So I booked a 6-week trip through Italy and southern France instead. Florence, Lake Como, Nice. Places Harold and I once promised ourselves we would visit after retirement before cancer quietly rewrote our plans. The morning my flight left San Francisco, Daniel drove me to the airport himself. Fog drifted low across the highway while soft jazz played quietly through the speakers of his car. At the departure terminal, he carried my suitcase onto the sidewalk and hugged me tightly before I walked inside. Really hugged me. The kind of embrace people give when they finally understand how close they came to losing something irreplaceable. "I am sorry, Mom," he whispered against my shoulder. "I know," I answered gently. And I did know. That was enough. As I walked toward security, I glanced once through the terminal windows at my son standing alone beside the curb in the pale morning light. He looked older than he had a year earlier. Wiser too. Grief does that sometimes. So does truth. On the flight to Rome, somewhere high above the Atlantic Ocean while strangers slept quietly around me beneath dim cabin lights, I finally understood something I wish more women my age believe before life forces it upon them. Respect is not something you purchase by sacrificing your dignity for other people's comfort. Real love does not ask you to shrink yourself to remain included. And family built only on obligation eventually collapses the second someone stops paying to hold it. Together, Claire thought I was funding a wedding. What I was really funding was revelation. And in the end, that turned out to be worth every single dollar.